panelists. We're honored to have with us 5 esteemed panelists who have a wide range of expertise in academia, public policy, governance, and activism. The research report was shared with the panelists, and they will be requested to respond to particular issues from their own perspective. We will start with Professor William Gumede, who is a renowned South African academic and author. He is Associate Professor at the Wits School of Governance and has worked at various international universities. He also serves on various international advisory boards and has been responsible for programs to teach MPs of the British Commonwealth and in South Africa. And he's also the founder and executive chairperson of Democracy Works Foundation and also the chairperson of Action Aid. Professor Gumede, over to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and also, also for the research on trust, which I think is very important. I wanted to talk really about trust and accountability. Accountability, I think, is crucial in building trust in government institutions. So if one doesn't get the accountability part right, we cannot get their trust. And accountability really in the context of trust, in basic terms, is to accept and to be held responsible for, or to be held account for one's actions. And I think that really is the really basic concept of accountability, which fosters trust if one can get that basic accountability right. Now, for the purposes of the public sector, accountability ensures that any leader, manager, and organization that uses public money and make decisions that affect people's lives can be held responsible for their actions. So it's about a relationship between the state and its citizens, and the extent to which the state is answerable for its actions. Now, there is where how trust is built. So accountability, therefore, lies at the heart of democratic government. And without that accountability, one cannot get a trust. Now, for me, the very first thing is there is an accountability ecosystem in the public sector. And normally that ecosystem involves, of course, the legal and reporting frameworks that the public sector has to be held accountable to. Then, of course, there's, within government departments or SOEs, there's internal controls, processes, and so on, which from accountability point of view, entities must adhere to. Then there's also the democratic oversight institutions such as Parliament, the Auditor General, Public Protector, Chapter 9 institutions, again, which is part of that accountability ecosystem. And then there's the non-state oversight institutions, the media, civil society, ordinary citizens. And then for me, the last part of the accountability ecosystem is consequences for a wrongdoing. Now, sadly, the South African public accountability system is broken, and that is why we have broken trust. So a broken accountability system in South Africa, which has been giving us broken trust. Often, I mean, if you look at the Auditor General reports every year, it always says, lack of decisive leadership to address lack of accountability. Media, civil society organizations, and whistleblowers consistently point out corruption, waste, poor public services, and so on. And because there's such a lack of trust, the judiciary has often been the last resort for ordinary citizens to hold elected and public officials accountable because of that broken accountability system. Now, within that system, I think the very first thing is that there seems to be a real struggle in that accountability is who is accountable for failures. Is it a minister or is it a public servant. And if one, have observed the Zondo Commission, their confusion about who responsibilities between the minister and the public servant really is one of the reasons why there's been a broken accountability, and also why we've seen lack of trust. So it's been very difficult to hold specific individuals accountable, whether it's the minister or the public servants, because there's no clarity, there's no clarification of role responsibilities between ministers and senior civil services. And also, clearly in the South African context, it appears that the principle of ministerial responsibility for the consequences of decisions made and policies implemented and public services delivered or not delivered under their watch is not enforced. Then the second one is also there seems to be lack of effective oversight over public servants. Now, the role of public servants, naturally, of course, is to ensure that policies are implemented. Now, what we see often is that we don't have effective oversight of public servants themselves. And Parliament, often do not call public servants and accounting officers to account directly. It's often, the department goes to Parliament, but, that the parliamentary oversight specifically over public servants is not that effective. Now, in order to restore or to get some kind of or a better oversight over public servants, we may have to think about in the future of having senior public servants directly be held accountable to Parliament for the implementation of policies, projects, and public services under their watch. Now, the third element in that broken system is accounting officers within departments, within SOEs. Often, unfortunately, the position of accounting officers within public entities are often not really, that the positions are not empowered. Now, what do I mean by empowered? Accounting officers often don't have the responsibility, and then often they are not held responsible more robustly. And maybe perhaps if we bring in personal liability for the cost of wrongdoing, it may then increase accountability. I mean, in 2018, of course, the Public Audit Amendment Act was ascended to, which gives the Auditor General powers to refer, or rather to hold accounting officers accountable for for wrongdoing and so on. So possible, that may help to hold accounting officers accountable, and also, I think, promote accountability and trust. Now, the other part of that, when I said that ecosystem, accountability ecosystem, which is important in public trust in public institutions, is, compliance with key legislation. Again, if one look at the Auditor General reports, a really big thing for the Auditor General has always been that both elected and public representatives often fail to comply with laws, reporting requirements and procedures, and there's no consequences for that. I mean, let's just take an example. I mean, compliance to Municipal Finance Management Act, for example. And the 2017, 2018 Auditor General report says, something like over 70% of municipalities didn't comply. I mean, you just have to imagine that kind of stats and what it means for public trust. And then, it's very important for accountability and trust is for a country to have or public sector to have a heads must roll culture. Now, in South Africa, we don't seem to have a heads must roll culture where people take accountability, where there's consequences for wrongdoing, and people resign or they step aside when they are implicated in wrongdoing. Now, maybe lastly is how, in order to build a much more effective accountability ecosystem, is how do we track recommendations of official inquiries? I mean, we had a Zondo commission, which is essentially almost looking into yes, it's looking into corruption, but it's really looking into accountability. Now, we have often in the country regularly, we have many inquiries, but we have been unable to track recommendations of inquiries. We've regular task teams, there's investigations, whether at the entity level, whether it's, as I say, like the Zondo Commission, but we're not tracking the recommendations. So it is going to be really important going forward, to strengthen the accountability system, that entities, public entities, should be required to regularly report to Parliament about their own internal investigations, the conclusions of those investigations, and the actions that they take. And also that that Parliament must also follow up on recommendations of official inquiries and task teams and so on, and track the implementation of it. And then, I mean, to recap, also that I think from a parliamentary point of view, a much more robust, there has to be a much more robust holding elected representatives accountable, and also holding public servants directly accountable. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Prof. Gumede, and thank you for also sticking to your 10 minutes on the dot. So very key issues that we currently have, what you call a broken system of accountability, and some concrete suggestions as to how we can strengthen the accountability and thereby also strengthen public trust. Chapter 9 institutions have a critical role to play in this accountability ecosystem, and we are therefore honoured to have with us Commissioner Philile Ntuli from the South African Human Rights Commission. Commissioner Ntuli has a range of academic qualifications in political science, public policy, sociology, gender studies, and a master's in social science. She's also currently studying towards a PhD in public law at UCT with a focus on the gendered nature of institutions. She has, throughout her work, had a strong focus on women's relationship, on gender issues, women's relationship with the state, African feminism, gender justice, as well as issues of public law policy and land reform. And Commissioner Ntuli has been a long-standing human rights activist in various capacities. Commissioner Ntuli will speak to us about issues around the ethical state as a critical enabler in restoring trust and confidence. Over to you, Commissioner Ntuli.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Greetings, the Minister in absentia, Directors General, and senior managers of the departments and other public institutions present, members of the academic fraternity, fellow panelists, honored guests, and all protocol observed. I greet you. Thank you very much for inviting us to this important launch. I do not come alone. I'm accompanied by Peace Moore, who's also in this meeting, who's also a staff member of the Human Rights Commission. Thank you very much for inviting us. On behalf of the Commission, we would firstly like to congratulate the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation on the launch of this very important publication on trust in government. Program Director, we've been asked to speak on the topic of an ethical state. In many ways, this forms a rejoinder to the discussion on accountability in the context of a broken system. Our thinking and contribution to this topic as the Human Rights Commission is informed by our own mandate, which is to protect, promote, and monitor the observance of human rights. We begin with the definition of an ethical state as provided by the medium-term strategic framework, which states that an ethical state is driven by constitutional values and principles of public administration as well as the rule of law, and focuses on the progressive realization of socioeconomic rights and social justice as outlined in the Bill of Rights. Program Director, this suggests two main drivers or foundations of ethics. The first is in accordance with Chapter 10, especially Section 195 of the Constitution, which defines the basic values and principles governing public administration, and as expressed in the Batopele principles, including professional ethics, efficient, economic and effective use of resources, and so forth. The second relates directly to the rule of law and its general application. Now, the execution of both, the definition suggests, must be focused on the protection and promotion of human rights. I would like to further problematize this definition as a way to lay bare the context within which we find ourselves having to think about this notion of what it means for a state to be ethical. There are three main categories or constructs of conduct which help us organize our participation in society as social beings, be it privately or publicly. It's also very easy or tempting to see these three as one. These are ethics, morality, and the law. We often think, well, if I obey the law and I'm moral, then it means I'm an ethical human being. My suggestion this morning, Program Director, is that one, there is more to ethics than just the law and morality. And two, it's important to understand this difference if we are going to understand what an ethical state means. Now, why should we care, you may ask? Well, because the majority of unethical conduct is legal, one, and is prevalent, or its prevalence in any public service environment can have grave consequences, such as decreased, internally at least, decreased work efforts, decreased time spent at work, more time spent avoiding the offender, declining performance, resignations of key personnel, and so on. And we know that externally as well, there are grave consequences, such as the results of corruption in the way that it deprives the delivery of services and the attainment of human rights. So what is the difference between the three, which is law, morality, and ethics, and why is it important? The first, being law, is more straightforward or narrow. It contains the formal rules that indicate the boundaries for what we can or cannot do. In other words, it enforces a standard of behavior. Morality, on the other hand, or in relation, is a more informal framework of values, principles, beliefs, and customs. These are not necessarily enforced by the state, but rather by social pressure through customs and traditions. People often inherit morality through social conditioning led by principal agents of socialization, such as religion and the family. Our moral compass helps us to answer the question of what to do and how to live. In many ways, Program Director, there are similarities between morality and ethics. However, what does set the two apart is a critical, unavoidable factor. Morality teaches submission to a moral authority, be it religion or elders, for example. A moral life can easily be an uncritical, unexamined existence. It can be applied without consciousness. Ethics, on the other hand, involves a process of reflection. It is a way to answer the question of what should I do from a reflexive place. Whether someone is ethical or unethical is determined by their own internalized values, principles, and purpose, not unthinking behavior or habits. Now, within this framework, an ethical behavior or decision is one that's based on conscious reflection, which is what gives effect to our values, principles, and purpose in pursuit of a proper goal. In an ideal world, ethics would shape our law and morality and not the other way around. When our conscious, reflective, ethical views on what's good or right change and become aligned to the principles enshrined in the Constitution, the results can be exponentially transformative. What this means for thinking about an ethical state, therefore, is that we have to remember that the state as an institution is simultaneously created by, as it creates the individuals who occupy the institution as public servants. And it also creates and is created by their social behavior. The Trusted Government Report highlights a critical finding, which is that where stronger consequences for unethical conduct is rated as the most effective potential intervention. How do we know, or how do we do this when public institutions are engrossed by cultures of impunity, where people get away with unethical conduct, resulting in others further engaging in wrong behavior, as stated by the report? And as the report further states, there is political interference, inappropriate appointments, and a lack of accountability, which was elaborated very well by the previous speaker. Furthermore, we know that the State Capture Commission has revealed how boards of state-owned enterprises have lost their moral compass and engaged in terribly unethical conduct. Public procurement systems in the public service have become breeding grounds for corruption and maladministration. The Trust in Government report further suggests and makes emphasis on inclusion in social, political, and economic opportunities, structures, and power as a critical pathway to an ethical state. But how do we practically do this? Program Director, in conclusion, in our view as the Human Rights Commission, what needs to be done to bring about an ethical state is, one, a common understanding that ethics is a precondition for safe, just, and prosperous societies. And in accordance with the medium-term strategic framework, I quote, "An ethical state strengthens governance and accountability between citizens and government." And this is an important factor for all of us to be in agreement on. Thereafter, then, practical initiatives to bring about an ethical state may include getting the right people, doing an intensive skills audit of the public service, and being courageous enough to attract skilled workers and also to let go of those who are not competent enough for the positions that they hold. An ethical framework or code for the public service, ethical scorecards for the public service, strong consequence management, and incentives for those who do engage in ethical behavior is also important as a way to encourage similar behavior in the future. And lastly, Program Director, then supporting or strengthening institutions such as the Public Service Commission, which should be strengthened to ensure that they adequately carry out their mandate of establishing a professional, ethical, principle-centered, and values-driven public service. Thank you very much, Program Director. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Ntuli. Very useful input in terms of just also unpacking the similarities and distinctions between ethics, morality, and the law, but also drilling down further into what is an ethical state, and some very valuable concrete suggestions. Thank you very much for that. Our next panelist is Dr. Yaqub Abba Omar. He is the Director of Operations at the Makubwe Institute of Strategic Affairs, and he has previously worked as the Head of Strategy at the Banking Association of South Africa. He also serves on, he's had a lot of experience in scenario planning, both in government, but also serves on the executive committee of the Ndlula Miti Scenarios Project and on various committees and boards. He has a long history in the public service since the early days of democracy, including in GCIS and Arms Corps, and has served 2 terms as a South African ambassador. In 2017, he completed his PhD in sociology, focusing on national identity and sovereignty. And prior to 1994, he served in the Department of Information and Publicity of the African National Congress. Thank you very much, Dr. Yaqub, and over to you. Thank you.
Oh, I'm muted there. I was saying thank you, Dr. Annette. It has been a while, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. Firstly, I must compliment the DPME for this wonderful report. I think it has been long been needed. We have been wanting to focus on this issue of trust, and I think you and your team, the team at DPME, has done a fantastic job in bringing in the range of issues that you've highlighted and the kind of questions that you have raised, which we both as South Africans and global citizens need to be answering. So I'm going to be touching on three areas, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with the entire report because there's so many things that, it's so rich, there's so many angles you can take. I'm going to be touching on one, the issue of democracy, the second on social cohesion, and the third one is, as you mentioned, having been in the GCI, is the role of government communicators. As far as democracy is concerned, I think, colleagues have been, both the two panelists before me have been talking about the importance of this connection and accountability and so forth. The reality has been that, throughout the world, there has been what people are calling a recession in democracy. Since 2005, the level of dissatisfaction with democratic systems has been increasing in most parts of the world, except a few what they call settled democracies, especially the North European democracies, which quite interestingly are the ones that feature high on your trust, your various indicators of trust. So if you look at just South Africa, in 2005, the level of dissatisfaction was about 28% of the population. And then by 2020, it had reached about 60%. And it'll be interesting to see what this year's results would show. So this talks to a couple of things. I think one of the things would be that when you've been looking at the various shifts in the trends that you've captured in your report, I think it'd be useful to overlay this with the kind of administrations we had at different points in time. I know it may be difficult for government and especially institutions which are located in the presidency to be personalizing this thing, but it's clear that during the Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki administration, the degree of satisfaction with democracy was much higher than during the decade of wasted years thereafter. So let's be frank about it so that we can start understanding what the situation is and what remedies we can actually be addressing. So that's the one part. And then this talks to another point that the report makes, that trust is not static, that it shifts and it moves and so forth. An area that I would like the people that are taking this report forward would be to look at the provincial differentials as well in terms of this trust. So I will refer to this later in the Ndlula Miti scenarios work, but it's quite clear that people experience institutions in different ways in different parts of our country. And you may find that in some parts, there will be a stronger sense of traditional authorities. In other parts where there's a much larger urban population, there's very little sense of the role of traditional authorities there. Are they trusted or not, I think would be important questions that we need to address quite specifically to the South African context. The second point, as I said, is around social cohesion. The report quotes the Mapungubwe's report on nation formation and social cohesion. I think what would be also useful would be to complement this with the work that Misra did for the National Planning Commission around social compacting, and the work that came out of the Department of Arts and Culture in the conference around social compacting as well. As you know, that in terms of the medium-term strategic framework, the question of social cohesion has been, the objective of social cohesion has been allocated to the Department of Arts and Culture. I think it'd be useful when looking at the pathways, is it correct to locate this issue of social cohesion in one line department or the other. I leave that for you to discuss. Then the third part of the social cohesion that I want to refer to is the inclusivity scenarios. I think most of you are familiar with that. It's a project that started in 2017, which was trying to understand how can we achieve social cohesion in South Africa by 2030. We use 2030 because of the SDG timelines as well as the NDP timelines. Did a huge amount of research, and we identified 3 key drivers that shaped social cohesion in South Africa. The one was around social inequality, and we weren't just talking about inequality itself, but social inequality, because we wanted to bring in the phenomenon of social capital into the being. The second one, which was quite a complex one, is that what we call the triple R, which refers to reconciliation, resistance, and resentment. Because we're saying that the project of reconciliation that's required for social cohesion has got 2 contending legs or directions. One is resentment, especially from the previously privileged groupings, especially the white groupings, that too much was being done for black people and they were not being allowed to have a say in the new South Africa. And resentment also at the level, and resistance to that, and resentment also from amongst black people that not enough was being done. So we call this the triple R key driver. And then the issue of institutional capacity and leadership. You quite correctly in the report say that this is not just a matter of the state. It impacts on all of us, government, civil society, faith-based organizations, etc. And the crisis we're seeing in 2017, 2018, in the worst periods of those 10 wasted years, was not just of one man or a group of people or an infamous family, but a system, a society that had suddenly become demobilized and wasn't able to gain back the voice and agency that it used to have. So that spoke to the institutional capacity and leadership. On the basis of that, as you know, we developed 3 scenarios, the Naile Walk, the Gwara Gwara scenario, and then obviously the Isibujwa scenario. And we've been tracking the movement of attitudes as well as hard indicators as to which scenario seems to be we've been moving in. So no guessing that we are moving definitely into the Gwara Gwara scenario. But the use of the barometer has been interesting, that it brings together a lot of the kind of indicators that you've been referring to, using a lot of the primary material that you have to help us kind of keep in tune with that. And I think that may be useful because I think each of the IJR, Afrobarometer, et cetera, feed into a certain set of variables. But I think being at the center, being in government, you need to have a kind of overlay over all this, because you need to think of a universal set of criteria that we can measure trust by. And so even the Edelman, et cetera, can feed into that. Hand in hand with that, as I mentioned, that we've been grappling with the notion of provincial barometers, because we see very distinct differences if you speak to people or look at the hard indicators in the Western Cape versus the indicators in Limpopo or Northern Cape, etc. So I would suggest that you consider that. The last and my most favorite is the role of government communications. I think there's a special place in heaven for government communicators that stay honest, firstly, but also who make sure that their principles remain honest and are open and engaged public. As government communicators, we can't have, there has to be trust in the communication that government comes out with. My first experience, shortly after I was appointed as Deputy DG of Government Communications, was when I went down to visit my family in Durban, and my grand aunt takes me aside and she says, "I hear you have a really important job in government now." And I said, "Yeah, Deputy CEO of GCIS, and we report to the then Deputy President Mbeki and things." So she said, "Oh, that's all very well. But if you're so important, how come I don't see you on TV?" So I obviously had difficulty explaining that one. I couldn't spin my way out of that question. So in conclusion then, we need to have what you've been calling in your report for greater transparency. I think the pathways that you've identified are very useful. But remember that we're turning a tanker. The state is a tanker, and it's going to need to be turned and steered carefully. But I have no doubt that it can be turned, and I think those three pathways would be very useful. But I think there are two principles that we have often claimed, put up on boards and slogans, etc., that we really need to live every day. Firstly, as public servants, the Batupele principles, we need to reignite them. They're really good, solid ways for us to be able to recompact with citizenry. And the other principles for our nation is that of Ubuntu. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Abba, and very, very useful reflection that the democratic recession is a global phenomenon, and that we have also had shifts over our different terms of office. The issue of social cohesion, yes, certainly, I think one would agree, and we have also been discussing this, that it is not simply an outcome of a single department, but rather an outcome of multiple activities, interventions, in fact, not only even in government, and then government communications are very, very useful. And we will certainly also look further into your proposal on provincial barometers. Let us then move on to the next speaker, Mr. Jan Hofmeyr. He's a socio-political analyst and a qualified strategic foresight professional with extensive experience in the implementation of quantitative and qualitative diagnostic tools with a focus on political and economic governance in fragile post-conflict societies. He heads the research and policy program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and also served as the lead investigator of the South African Reconciliation Barometer. And he is currently on the Senior Advisory Committee of Afro Barometer, which has already been mentioned. Over to you, Mr. Hofmeyr. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director Dr. Griesel. Good morning to everyone on this call. It's a great privilege for IJR to have been invited to participate in this discussion alongside a panel of very esteemed commentators and people with expertise in this field. So this morning's theme, we believe, is one that is really critical to address now, probably more than ever in our country's short democratic history. Trust within a governance system is important as a lubricant for its efficient functioning at the best of times, and hence even more so at the worst of times. And I think we can safely say that at least since our transition to democracy in 1994, we do find ourselves in very challenging times. So in my presentation this morning, I would like to just focus on three issues. Firstly, I think where we feel the relevance of trust in a governance system is located at this particular juncture that we find ourselves in. Then I just want to briefly share some Afrobarometer findings, very recent Afrobarometer findings on trust in public institutions, and also maybe contextualize it a little in the SADC region where we do most of our research. And then lastly, just make a few comments also on the pathways that have been suggested for going forward in terms of trust in institutions as suggested in this document. So starting just with the relevance of the topic, I think it's safe to say that with many of our citizens feeling extreme existential anxiety characterized by economic distress and personal trauma, there's a sense of pervasive vulnerability throughout our country. We've just heard this week that more than a third of our labor force is unable to take their destiny in their own hands through earning an income of their own. And many, because of this desperation, are looking towards government and its institutions for some sort of support and reprieve. And government, for its part, is fiscally constrained. And there are simply no or not enough financial resources commensurate with the scale of the social challenges that we currently face to meet them. So in these times, it almost feels a bit macabre to repeat even such a brief description of the distress that our people find themselves in. But it is important to provide this backdrop because it underscores how instrumental government and its institutions will have to become in arresting the decline that we find ourselves in, and also putting our country on a sustainable development path. This will require decisive and far-reaching, and dare I say, radical reforms, which, regardless of their ideological orientation, I cannot imagine will come without some pain being inflicted somewhere within our society. And to bear such temporal pain in anticipation of a still to materialize future gain in the form of an inclusive and just society, ordinary people and stakeholder groups need to implicitly trust the government institutions to do the right thing. If not, the remedy may, instead of healing the patient, further aggravate its condition. And it's for this reason that this study is of such relevance right now. And therefore, I would really like to commend and congratulate the DPME for embarking on this very important endeavor and for producing an extensive document that seeks to look at the question of trust in all its facets, but in particular with its focus on institutional trust, which together with social trust forms two important components of the broader endeavor towards social cohesion. I think it is brave to embark on this right now, and I think it is also a very forthright and reflective document, and it's also quite self-critical, and I think that it for all of these reasons it need to be commended and welcome. I'm here this morning wearing two distinct hats. One is as head of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation's Research and Policy Unit, which produces the South African Reconciliation Barometer, which is also quoted in this report. And the departure point of the Reconciliation Barometer is that horizontal and vertical dimensions of trust are inextricably linked. But our focus falls more on the social, interpersonal trust dimension in the barometer and on reconciliation in particular. As such, we look at institutional trust through the lens of reconciliation and how that impacts on the promotion of a more reconciled society. My second hat is that of an Afrobarometer's senior advisory team member that is responsible for the conduct of Afrobarometer's surveys in Southern Africa. So as you know, Afrobarometer is a continental survey that looks at issues of governance in about 36 countries across the continent and provides a comparative perspective on issues of governance and also on the question of trust. So by its very nature, Afrobarometer focus falls more strongly on the vertical institutional trust dimension that we're talking about this morning. Earlier this week, we've released our latest findings on trust in South African public institutions, and I can confirm that its results largely aligns also with some of the results that we have seen in the report that we are launching here today. Since we've started measuring trust in institutions in 2006 in Afrobarometer, trust in these institutions have been in perennial decline, with almost all institutions reaching their lowest levels of trust in years. This is case for the legislative, the executive, and increasingly worryingly for us, also the judicial arms of the state. As the report rightly notes, institutional trust is not solely an affliction of the South African state. We're seeing around the world democratic deficits emerging, particularly also in recent years in the so-called established democracies of the North. So democracies around the world are struggling, and our Institute's contribution to the work of Afrobarometer focuses specifically on Southern Africa, and we look at issues of trust also within this part of the continent. So how do we compare with the regional SADC context? And this is the second part of my contribution. So of the 11 countries that we have surveyed in the round 8 of our survey, South Africa, with a 27% trust rating for parliament, is ranked the second lowest, just above Lesotho, and just below the parliament or the legislature of Angola. If one looks at the percentage of respondents who said that they've got a lot of trust in our parliament, that figure goes down to about 11%. So the social capital of parliament is fairly low. Only the Basotho trust their politicians less than South Africans. In the most recent round of the survey, only 28% said that they trusted elected representatives from the ruling party, and 24% said that they trusted their counterparts in opposition parties. In terms of trust in electoral commissions, South Africa, with a 36% rating, finds itself in the third last position, just ahead of Angola and Malawi. President Ramaphosa, with a 38% trust level, scores also second lowest among his presidential peers in this region, just closely eclipsing his Angolan counterpart, João Lourenço. Maybe two caveats is important here. So firstly, trust levels on most measurements for the region in general was low. So the South African low score or low levels of trust should also be seen within the context of regional low levels. Secondly, and I think this is also significant, because of South Africa's robust and free press, the weakness of the state is also more widely publicized, and hence the state is also exposed to more criticism. And I think this is also something that we have to celebrate in terms of ensuring that there is an ethical state. We also have a very robust fourth estate to keep it in check. And they have, hence, in South Africa, the one institution that also then generated the most trust amongst all our respondents has been private media outlets. So in light of the above, we can say that state institutions are finding themselves in a precarious position in terms of the social capital that it has at its disposal to effect the kinds of change that we as a country need at the moment. So where do we start to address the bigger issues? And I've sort of taken particular note and also commend the pathways to change that have been identified in the report in terms of the developmental state, the capable state, and ethical state. But all of these things cost money, and in a fiscally constrained environment, we have to prioritize. And it's here where I think I have to concur with previous presenters as well, that we need to focus firstly on issues around the ethical state, ensuring accountability, ensuring, for example, that the public protector has got the scope and capacity to protect ordinary South Africans against excesses of powers of the state, that politicians pay attention, for example, to the reports of the Auditor General, to ensure that those in power are being held accountable. In that way, we will start or make our first strides with a relatively lower sort of investment in order to ensure that we get closer to that objective of trust in our society. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hofmeyr. Very useful insights, and also for sharing with us the results of the Afrobarometer and comparisons with SADC, as well as your remedies that we can consider. Last but not least, we have with us Dr. Theo Chiviru, who is a governance expert and with experience supporting governments and civil society to develop and implement governance reforms in Africa. He is the regional lead for Africa and the Middle East at the Open Government Partnership, and responsible for leading strategy development, advocacy, fundraising partnerships with multilateral organizations, civil society, and governance. Theo has been a policy manager for transparency and accountability at One Campaign, and has worked with a range of organizations, including our own IDASA, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, and Save the Children Sweden. Theo is a founder of New Thinking Development, an initiative that encourages collective action between government, business, and civil society to promote citizen-focused innovation and policy making in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much, Dr. Chiviru. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to say you are too kind to call me a doctor. I'm not there yet, but thank you for inviting me to come and share my thoughts around the issue of trust. Just to highlight that I work for the Open Government Partnership. The Open Government Partnership is a global partnership of now 78 governments and 76 local governments that come together to advance the principles of open government, which is transparency, accountability, citizen participation, inclusiveness, and participation. And South Africa, being a founding member of the Open Government Partnership 10 years ago, has been quite instrumental in terms of shaping globally and regionally the principles of open government. And I think the discussion around trust is happening at a very opportune time, both for the partnership but also for South Africa, because 2 years ago the Open Government Partnership launched a report basically talking around called trust, and looking at the various issues around trust, from women empowerment, looking at issues of youth, looking at democracy and so forth. So I could share the link on the trust publication that we produced 2 years ago. And the idea around this, which is really connected to our discussion today, is around how do citizens begin to trust state institutions? And my intervention this morning is really going to be focused on the citizen, in terms of how do we make sure that, how do we create processes that ensure that the citizen actually begins to trust in public institutions. I think one has to understand that there is, I think at the moment we are living in a very different time, where citizens have so much information at their disposal because of technology. And so because of this information that citizens have, it actually, creates a high expectation on the government to make sure that they deliver, they perform on the needs of the citizen. And we will see, I think we will all agree that, recent political events that are, sweeping across both South Africa, but also globally, I think reflect a deep, a loss of faith in government and state institutions. Citizens now, perceive their institutions to be captured because of corruption, because of inequality, because of poverty, and that state institutions are actually disconnected from the needs of the citizens and the constituencies, and that the state institutions have become complicit to the needs of citizens, that only the the rich and the powerful are beginning to benefit from state resources at the expense of citizens. And I think this is quite evident even in our South African context, that when we look at the riots that we have seen, the protests that we see on a daily basis across the country, is a reflection of the discontent that citizens actually have with state institutions. And I think this growing inequality, this growing discontent, this disgruntlement that we are seeing from citizens, one has to to think that it's sort of it's setting a new social contract that we are seeing between government and citizens, and it's sort of the have and the have-nots has become has been crippling within our society, within the state, but also within how affecting the relationship between the state and citizens. And we have millions of South Africans that now, as we speak today, feel that they've been left behind. They've been left behind around issues of health, issues of education, issues of housing, water and sanitation. And this, I think, in itself speaks to what we are now seeing the citizen, responding to the state and trying to find their space to be heard, trying to create spaces for themselves as the citizen to be heard around the concerns that they have, around the issues that they're actually affecting them. Now, most often, citizens have solutions to the challenges that affect them. And in so many instances, these solutions are not part of the policy development, are not included in policy. And this is why globally and even in South Africa, we are seeing a rise of the citizen. And it is the citizen who are saying, we want to be heard. And I think more, over the last 10 years, we have seen a decline in spaces for citizens to actually influence policy, for citizens to be heard, and citizens to be able to influence what governments actually implement. And this is a result of the death of genuine public participation. And I think we are seeing a decline in spaces for citizen participation. These spaces are declining rapidly, and this is why, as these spaces decline, the threat on democratic institutions is happening. That is how we see the trust in government institutions is actually happening. Secondly, it is the decline and the death of genuine public debate. The spaces for public debate are declining as well, and you'll see a correlation between the decline of participation and genuine public debate to the decline of trust in state institutions. So, for us to actually push back on this decline, there is need for bold and genuine and very radical responses that we need to see from the state. There is need for better partnerships that have to be built between the state and citizens, the state and civil society, the state and the business sector, so that we can actually very much push back on this decline, in state institutions. And again, these bold and radical processes and innovations that we want to see from the state all speak to some of the issues that have actually been spoken by other colleagues before, but also what have been clearly highlighted in the report around the issues of openness. Openness becomes important, that citizens need to know what is happening with the state, how decisions are being made, who is making the decisions. Fairness as a second principle, which is very important. Inclusion, creating policies and processes that are embedded in inclusion and citizens themselves. Responsiveness, the state needs to be responsive to its citizens. Only then can citizens know that they are being heard. Only then can citizens know that their views are being included in policy and are being included in government strategies and are included in government processes. But also participation as the fifth principle. But all these principles that are the 5 principles that I've highlighted work together. They cannot work in isolation. They have to work together for us to be able to then rebuild the trust that has declined. And I think this gives citizens an opportunity to influence policy, as I've said, but also for them to know that they're being heard. And when we look at all these principles that I've spoken about, are principles of the open government approach that the 78 countries that I've highlighted are actually trying to advance. And we are seeing a number of examples. I think South Africa has a number of opportunities where these principles can actually flourish, and where these principles can actually, turn the tide around building trust. And we have, through the Open Government Partnership, some very innovative programs that have come out of the state that have not been fully utilized to actually rebuild trust with citizens. For example, there is the Vuleka Mali platform that has been created between civil society and Treasury. And the idea around Vuleka Mali is actually to publish budget information, and citizens to be able to review, analyze, but also to provide feedback to the state. And we are seeing this across the 78 countries, where citizens are talking about, we need to know how budgets are being created, how budgets are being spent. Citizens are talking about contracts. Who is giving contracts? How are contracts being given? For example, in the housing, in the water and sanitation, billions of dollars are getting into public service delivery. But no one knows who is, there's so much opaqueness in terms of how these contracts are being given. There's so much opaqueness in terms of how these contracts are actually being spent. And in so many circumstances, a lot of these public services are not fully completed. And such processes, actually, diminish the democratic dispensation, diminish the ideals of democracy that speak on the need for the citizens and speak to the citizen directly. And just to give you two examples that I would like to share with you, where we have seen open government values, open government principles, and the principles that I've mentioned actually creating better trust. And there I would like to take you to a very small province in Ghana that is called Sekondi Takoradi, which made a commitment through the open government partnership to actually turn the tide around corruption that was happening in the land, in the buying and the use of land. And Sekondi Takoradi created a platform that is called STMA 360. And the main purpose for that, the STMA 360, was to digitalize the application of land use, because there was so much corruption, there was so much, buildings were mushrooming on a daily basis, and nobody knew how these land barons had been able to actually, get permits to actually construct buildings there. And the STMA 360, what it's doing for Sekondi Takoradi is that when you want to apply for land use, everything is done digitally, reducing the number, the human hand, and reducing the possibility of corruption. And this information, the STMA then goes a step further and actually publishes all the information, that is not sensitive, so to speak, information that is not sensitive around the application of the land use to the citizens. So anyone who wants to know who is applying for the land use, what land use is being, what each individual companies is applying for, have access to this information. And this has actually created a better partnership between the local government in Sekondi Takoradi and government. And in my closing, just to highlight and reiterate 5 open government approaches that I think would be important, for DPME, even with other departments, in terms of thinking through as you develop strategies and programs in terms of rebuilding this trust. And some of them I've already highlighted. Number one, providing citizens with meaningful information. Citizens need to know what is happening. Where is the money coming from? Where is it going? Where is public contracts? Citizens need to know the investments that governments are making. Secondly, empowering citizens by making sure that citizens are able to influence policy and strategies within government. Thirdly, making sure that we reach the marginalized, because these are the people that feel left out. These are the people that do not have information. How do we actively reach out to the marginalized communities, women, youth, rural population, disabled people? The fourth thing is responding to citizens. Government needs to respond to citizens. We know that DPME is working on through its M&E processes. How do we make sure that these M&E processes that are being created are citizen focused? Citizens are able to monitor, the activities of government, the investments of government. And then, in the fourth and final one is building partnerships with citizens. Government cannot do this alone. A new social contract is needed between government and citizens. A new social contract that is built on trust, a new social contract that is built on openness, a new social contract that is built on accountability, and most importantly, a new social contract that is built on citizen participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chiviru. We withdraw the doctorate for now. Okay, thank you very much for also very rich presentation and again highlighting the growing social distance between government and the citizenry, but also the issues of broken promises, in terms of quality of life, and emphasis on open government principles, stronger public participation, and inclusion of the voice of citizenry in policy development. But I think also your example of Ghana, very interesting, using digitalization and modernization to reduce corruption and improve transparency. Colleagues, there we have the inputs from the 5 panelists. As I say, very, very rich inputs that have really